Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Mayan Krivachet, and I am the Communications and Administration Coordinator here at Gutman Library. Welcome to Gutman Library Book Talk, New Civics, New Citizens, Critical, Competent, and Responsible Agents. I'm so happy that to see all of you here and the folks over on Zoom. Both editors are joining us today. We have Helen Haste, who many of you know, Professor Emerita in Psychology at the University of Bath in the UK. She was visiting professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education from 2003 to 2018. And we have Janine Bempechat, who is clinical professor at Boston University, Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll let you take over.
Thank you very much, Mayan. It's so nice to be back. It feels like coming home. So thank you for the very kind welcome you've given me. Janine and I have worked very hard on this book, and we worked out the other day that we've actually known each other 30 years. We first met actually co-supervising a very interesting doctoral student back in the 1990s. And of course, our wonderful 16 authors who contributed to the book, 3 of whom are here and will be interviewed by Janine in the second half of the presentation. I'd also like to introduce our publisher, John Bennett from Brill, who tells us that he has lots of books available for sale, lots of flyers about the book, but also it's available on brill.com. It's not quite yet available on Amazon, but it will be, so you can get it on Amazon as well. Anyway, we're talking about the book that we put together, and we'll summarize bits of it. I'm really looking forward to hearing the 3 authors who could be present talking a bit more detail about their own chapters. So, where does New Civics come from? Basically, New Civics began to emerge about, I guess, 25 years ago, beginnings of it, with a realization that traditional civics teaching in this country and internationally had problems. It was too limited, it had a particular orientation that didn't really capture the needs of the growing citizens who we as educators were concerned to educate. One concern was the concerns about declining conventional participation. People didn't vote, which worried people. But at the same time, there was a wide range of social movements with lots of youth involvement, and also a changed emphasis in the targets of their action. So this was happening in parallel with less voting. There was much more, or seemed to be much more, youth participation in a different kind of activism. There were also very important local and global changes in how democracy was defined. What counts as democratic practice, and what counts as democratic structure, and what should be the goals, in fact, of democracy itself, and of course, democratic education. So, what were the threats? Well, I don't need to tell you about the problems that the world faces at the moment. Heaven's sake, we know too well. There are macro problems. There are macro issues around the rise of authoritarianism, various forms of polarization, and basically clashes between groups and emerging different forces and groups, and which are very worrying. And of course, challenges to democracy practice where it is being practiced. But also there are other concerns too. One thing I've become very interested in is the fact that we don't educate young people for uncertainty. We live in an uncertain world. There are hundreds of books that have come out in the last few years pointing out that they're basically doom-watch books. Doom-watch in all areas, climate change only being one of them. But it occurred to me actually some time ago now that really one of the issues is we do not educate young people to manage uncertainty and ambiguity. And one way one can explain, for example, conspiracy theories is that they are the seduction of certainty. And in a sense, as educators, we may be able to do more to look at the way that young people manage ambiguity than expecting young people to solve the world's problems overnight, which of course is totally unreasonable. So what skills are needed for New Civics and how can they be fostered? And having thinking about that also, what are implications not only for education practice, but the implications for research and policy and the methodology around practice. So there are implications of New Civics, not only for what we do in the classroom, but also how we actually research it. And there's a lot of very innovative work, including some reported in our volume about changes and advances, exciting advances in methodology around New Civics. Now, where do we come from? Where did the book come from? The book, as you, I think, all know, comes out of a very exciting program, which I was extremely honored to lead, which was funded by the Spencer Foundation between 2013 and 2017. The Spencer Foundation, as always, has a very sophisticated and forward-looking view of the world, and they developed an initiative in New Civics about less than 20 years ago. And we were one of the beneficiaries of this, because they funded us to support essentially a community of scholars, doctoral students who are working broadly, very broadly, across many disciplines in the field of New Civics. And our community was designed to give them the support. Several people in this room were part of that. And the support was really, it was alongside what they were doing in their doctoral research. It was a way of bringing people together. It was a kind of like a sort of really superior writing group, if you like, or extended writing groups. That's one way of looking at it. But the main thing was we really were encouraging people from very different disciplines, very different perspectives, methodologies, and so on. And it really worked as a very exciting community. I have to say, it was one of the more exciting periods of my life as an academic, as a researcher, as a writer, to be part of that, because I saw some really exciting people develop some really exciting ideas. And I had, of course, some wonderful colleagues here and, of course, internationally, because there were also, as well as the fact we had 30 students who were actually officially scholars on the program, who came not only from HGSE, but also from public health and from MIT. We had many, many visitors, postgraduates, senior scholars, and policymakers from all 6 continents. I checked it out in my head. It was really all 6 continents. So we're very proud to attract so many people's interest, so much interest in so many people. And many of those people I have remained in contact with and continue to network with. So it laid the foundation for a global network of scholar connections. And out of it came 2 publications. One was a Teachers College, a special issue of Teachers College Record that came out in 2021, where 7 of our scholars contributed. And also this book we're talking about today, New Civics, New Citizens, Critical, Competent, and Responsible Agents, British Publishing, which involves 16 people, 16 of people who are associated with the New Civics program. So, what were we looking? Well, you can imagine that with such an extremely eclectic range of people, extremely eclectic range of topics and interests and methods, it was quite interesting to try and put together a volume which brought together something fairly coherent. And we actually realized as we did it that there were 3 broad themes, and these 3 themes, in fact, really reflect some of the dominant themes of New Civics. The 3 themes are changing definitions, and culture and the relationship between goals, practices, and structures, and thirdly, skills, motives, and values seen as necessary for effective civic engagement. I'll read the bit where we describe these things. It's easy. Sorry. The theme of changing definitions includes how democracy is being conceptualized and practiced in this current period of global change and transition. Among other things, this has considerably challenged many taken for granted assumptions rooted in US practice and in US history and research. Now, so, for example, widening the definition of participation includes what actions are constitutive, what function the actions serve within the polity, and to what ends these might serve society. It also includes attention to issues of social concern, for example, changing definitions of democracy and of well-being and of social justice. And of course, civic identity itself derives both from definitions of citizenship and actions engaged in as a citizen. So that, in a sense, touches on rather limited at the moment on the changing definition. The main thing that when definitions change, society can change, people can change. So regard changing definitions is a very important part of what we were doing. The second theme of culture and the relationship between goals, practices, and structures includes the existing narratives and norms that sustain and current situations, and also emergent ones, the emergent ones that will in fact affect change. And of course, media plays an important role in this. Several chapters explore the dynamics of social interactions and power relationships and roles in schools and elsewhere. And again, how do stories of national identity and history shape the way that social structures and values are defined? And what do we, when we wish to innovate, what do we have to modify and change? That's a theme which links up culture and structure. The third theme, focusing on skills, motives, and values. Where are these to be learned, and what pedagogy is needed to develop them? And this theme includes, for example, descriptions of curricula and programs designed to innovate. And they've examples like fostering agency, critical thinking, awareness of cultural assumptions, as well, of course, as the basic skills of organizing, collaborating, and transferring knowledge and reasoning. Now, there are 16 contributors. I can't do justice, of course, in the time available for all of them. So I'm just briefly going to talk about, mention the people. We've got a list here under the first, broadly, the first theme, changing definitions. Alan Agara, sorry, Ben Bowman, for example, looks at how youth participation around climate change and the exercise of dissent in general amongst young people, how this shifts definitions of participation. Jake Fay looks at discourses around school closures, particularly how the way injustice is defined, and how this definition reflects assumptions about how democracy itself is defined. Matthew Patrick Shaw explores how managing the very tricky legal task of overcoming discrimination at Harvard revealed assumptions about roles, for example, the role of in loco parentis. Alan Agaranov, very elegantly, through an elegant experiment, shows how if you deliberately break rules, you reveal the underlying norms and discourses of institutional practices. It's very entertaining how he did it, but I won't tell you it in the book. Xinjiang shows how the rural-urban gap in China very vividly reflects conflicting ideas of good citizenship within China and how they are changing. And of course, her chapter also reveals how very differently Chinese society defines many of the attributes that we associate with civic life. Under the second theme, firstly, Pinar Gunnar explores the identity struggles that Turkish Muslim girls experience in German society. Siwen Zhang shows how Chinese teachers struggled with different civic education goals when they were managing students' potential involvement in a protest around the siting of a factory. Sanjay Nanwani describes the different classroom practices of some Colombian teachers and how their goals and their concepts are explicitly reflected in their teaching style, and of course have an impact then on what they teach and how they teach. Arvid Nagel, Horst Wiedemann, and Fritz Ozer show that the rules and perceptions around cyberbullying, which is an important example of peer norms, are different from the conventional bullying sanctions. So if you looked at bullying maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you have a very different impression of what kids worried about. They actually found that the young people they studied in Switzerland were much more tolerant to certain kinds of cyberbullying in the way that they wouldn't have been perhaps, in the previous pre-digital world. Chen provides very striking data on the way that it's a very strong Chinese social value and metaphor, the management and conservation of luck. It actually, very surprisingly, interweaves with these students learning about theoretical physics. Really, it did. There's an intersection between how they thought of conservation of luck and how they sort of entropy in the second law of thermodynamics. It's one of the more astounding topics that I have ever supervised. The third theme. In the third theme, Isolde de Groot looks at mock elections. She's working in the Netherlands, and shows how they are conducted, that how they're conducted reflect specific implicit definitions of democracy, and that actually preparing people for a critical and interrogative thick democracy requires different models and practices from that's normally assumed within the mock election model. Bonnie McIntosh, who studied very young children and looked at the foundations of social competence, and she shows, in fact, that young children may have much more sophisticated understanding of social dynamics than is picked up when people look at appropriate skills in their learning. And the education, therefore, for very young children should be redefining the goals and skills to take account of actually what's happening in the basis of social competence. And Everardo Perez Manjares explores the very topical field of history education, and national identity, and therefore civic educators' goals. And he argues, in fact, for fostering multi-perspectivity within a history program. Now, I haven't mentioned three people who are sitting here because Janine is about to interview them: Erhard, Liu, and James. So I'll now turn it over to Janine. What, switch this off just a minute?
No, slide. Just, yes. There we
Yes, sorry, yes, I'll pick it up.
go. Thank you.
You need this, Janine.
I will take a microphone. I'll take a.
Okay. So this will be here.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, everyone, for being here and allowing us this chance to talk about three wonderful contributions to our volume. So I'd like to begin with Lou, who did such an interesting ethnographic study. And so I want to begin with this sort of general question. You noted in the chapter how China has a policy of explicitly blending civic and moral education. And you highlight two moral discourses of citizenship education: authoritarian patriotism and individual growth, the concept of civic. Can you say more about these discourses?
Thank you, Janine. Yeah, so in my chapter, I surveyed literature on what Chinese schools teach in their civic education classes, and identified those two discourses on how the state think that the students or individual citizens should relate to the nation state. So the first discourse that I call authoritarian patriotism basically required individual citizens to be patriotic and loyal to the nation state, and especially the Chinese Communist Party as a ruling regime. And the second discourse is rooted in the Chinese concept of 素质 or attributes or qualities of all sorts that they regard as superior and essential for political leadership as well as competition in the global economy. So this discourse, in a sense, position individual citizens to be both responsible for the collective interests of the nation state and as well as for their individual development and success, which are linked together. So those are the two discourses.
Thank you. In your chapter, you examine how Chinese cultural and socio-political concepts translate into educational practice, and you do so through your study of the cadre system. Can you tell us first what the cadre system is, and second, how you came to be interested in studying its impact on students' values-based decision-making?
So the cadre system is a practice of student leadership institutionalized across Chinese classrooms of all school levels. In a sense, students, the schools in China are organized around the unit of class. All students of the same class stay together in the same classroom throughout the school day for at least a whole school year. and teachers of different subjects rotate in and out of the classroom to deliver their respective lessons. And the extracurricular activities and disciplinary measures are also organized along the unit of class. For example, each class competes with one another in sport competition organized by the school, and the school usually inspects each class and rank them according to a list of disciplinary measures such as the cleanliness of the classroom. So within such a system, the class categories are usually a group of students selected within each class to help manage the class, their classmates on behalf of the teachers. So when I first started my field work in a Chinese school, I was hoping to study student experience with civic education beyond the formal school curriculum. And then I immediately noticed those class categories because they just stand out very clearly in terms of the amount of power and responsibility they have. For example, when most students of a classroom, most of the time, just mind their own business studying, these students, those class categories, they will get to get out of their seats and collect homework on behalf of the teacher. They get to stand on the teacher's podium to make announcements on behalf of teachers. And sometimes they even get to call out publicly names of the student who's misbehaving. So there is quite a those amount of power and responsibility that they display in their everyday work. And then when I started talking to them, I also realized a lot of those dilemmas and tensions they face. When I treat those dilemmas, I start to see how they reflect larger tensions in Chinese society. For example, about how one should relate to authority and the practice while trying to protect their own interests. So that's how I start getting interested in how this implication of civic education might be.
How long actually was your period of data collection?
So if you consider my initial entry into a school that started around 2016, 2017 for summer, and then my actual dissertation work was in 2019 for the fall semester, and then I continued through the pandemic, although digitally, then the whole data collection for dissertation was about a year.
What surprised you the most in your findings?
So in this chapter, I describe the incident of conflict between class editors and their classmates when two specific categories were tasked with making an announcement of a set of rules made by the teacher. And the students were very not happy about the rules, so they were confronting those categories. And I identified 3 different strategies those categories use, or students think those categories should use to address this conflict. And one of the strategies that surprised me the most was how category pursued ways to, went out of these ways to basically help his classmates to cheat around the rules in order to achieve those anger of his classmates. And later in my larger dissertation work, I found those strategies were actually very common across multiple classes that I observed in 2 different Chinese schools. In the chapter, this specific category, he did that out of a utilitarian calculation of self-interest when he figured that it benefited him more to have a good relationship with his peers than following teacher orders as a cause of relationship. But for other students that I observed in other classes and also in the classes, a lot of them actually try to help their classmates due to their actions are guided by other cultural values, such as a particular morality of prioritizing relationship of one inner circle, and some kind of conceptions of political leadership rooted in a more historical tradition of Chinese political leadership, such as the Maoist or the Confucian tradition that has positive orientation. So I was fascinated to see how those larger cultural narratives get to translate and replicate it in the everyday work of those students in the classroom.
One last question briefly. I mean, I don't know if you can answer briefly, but obviously your work has implications for civic education in China. Thinking about the insights you gained, is there a message for educators elsewhere in the world?
That's a very good question. So, yeah, I think there could be two takeaways, at least two takeaways. One is that while most of the research are still focusing on formal school curriculum, when we think about civic education, this is tied to the movement of new civics. As we extend our attention beyond voting and learning formal civic knowledge to other forms of civic participation. I think my work also shows that institutional structure beyond the school curriculum, such as those practices of student leadership, could function as civic education. While the task cadre system might seem unique to the Chinese context, similar practices of student leadership actually exist in many parts of Asia and elsewhere, especially society that's like post-communist. Because like China, many of those countries imported those systems from the Soviet Union. So that's one area I think of implication in terms of paying broader attention to the education in school beyond the curriculum. And another takeaway, I think, is that these tensions that I observe for my students between following authorities and serving peer interest, or between individual achievement and collective responsibility, as illustrated in my broader dissertation work. These tensions, I think, also take place in many other societies. So I think it would be important for educators to be aware of those contradicting demands that our society and state make of our students, and to tune into student experiences, and also be aware of the cultural resources available in order to better help them navigate those tensions of modern society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So James, the focus of your chapter is teacher professional development. And you open it by describing how, despite the general consensus that teacher professional development is an important tool for improving teacher education and student learning, it's widely seen as ineffective. I especially appreciate the quote that schools and districts bombard teachers with help, but most of it is unhelpful. Can you say more about this perspective?
Sure. Yeah, that quote comes from a report about teacher professional development in the US. And the motivation for this chapter was kind of an observation from my own experience and practice that professional development was widespread. Anyone who's worked in schools, been in schools, knows that professional development is kind of a regular ritual for teachers, and also a ritual that is not welcomed, that people don't look forward to it, generally don't enjoy it, resent it, sit with clenched teeth. But there is also a consensus understanding that learning is important. Continuous learning, growth, development, improvement is important. And so we've got these like blocks of time that are reserved for learning, but there's like relatively little thought given to what goes into those. And as I write about in this chapter, there's kind of an underlying system of kind of beliefs and values that guides how that time is designed and deployed and used. And the reason I think it's seen as unhelpful is because of those kind of underlying values and beliefs that are very, very influential, but unconscious or unstated. And so the goal in this chapter was to kind of do some kind of service.
Yeah, and in doing so, we draw on two socio-political frameworks, the efficiency framework and the deliberative framework, which you argue is very suited to effective learning. What are the assumptions about teaching that underlie these two frameworks?
It's a really good question. I think that the assumptions that underlie this efficiency framework, which are prevalent and predominant, at least in the US context, is that, first of all, that we know what good teaching looks like. That the kind of constitutive elements of what good teaching is are common, widespread, and known. And that those elements can be taught. That we can kind of give people the knowledge and the skills they need to teach well. There's an accompanying assumption that that ineffective teaching practices are rampant and widespread and need to be corrected. And to do so will improve the kind of efficiency of the system overall. It's very linear, very hierarchical, very outcomes driven. The deliberative framework, which I use in the deliberative democratic theory as kind of kind of guardrail or the kind of framework for this, is that teaching is actually is a dynamic and fluid practice. That like the best elements are kind of the context dependent individuals, kind of prior learning and prior experiences and beliefs kind of contribute to how they undertake the practice of teaching. And so that the purpose of professional development and a deliberative framework is to help people come to that understanding and to kind of build on some of the threats that Helen talked about to manage the uncertainty that happens in the classroom, to be prepared to kind of manage that rather than following a recipe.
Thank you. So having said that, how do we move towards the model that you would love to see implemented?
Right. Tentatively. I think that there's kind of like two ways to kind of move forward. So there's kind of an individual level and a system. And I talk about this a little bit in the chapter. Individually, I think the way that professional development or professional learning is organized, rather than kind of a sit and get kind of much like this room is organized at the moment, where there's kind of expertise at the front, kind of projecting out. That it's much more about like what each table looks like, which is that people are kind of sitting in community, kind of surfacing dilemmas of practice together and doing a lot of common sense making. There's kind of a tradition of this around critical friendship, critical friends groups, use of protocols around kind of structuring conversation and surfacing dilemmas of practice. At a system level, I think that's much more complicated because it's very messy. And so there's like but it depends, I think, on helping to build expertise for deliberation across the system. So helping to develop facilitators and the facilitative skills required so that each table might have somebody who can lead those conversations, lead those programs, and create models of professional learning that are more flat, more collaborative.
Thank you. Thank you. Earhart, here's a statement.
You're to say.
It is convincingly argued that public education has failed in its basic mission to prepare students to be civically engaged in a variety of ways. So in this context, how do we prepare students to be critical consumers and active users of technology platforms that present competing information and indeed disinformation?
Yeah, tough question. And something that's changing all the time, actually, especially in the age of generative AI, we're seeing that be a much more complicated question as to the nature of technology and how it's affecting political practices, both, local levels as well as international and national levels. But I think my answer to that question really comes back to the second half of how you were describing our young citizens, which was not as consumers, but as active participants. That we actually need to lean into that idea of agency. And so one of the things that I try and argue in the chapter is that we really need to be thinking beyond kind of media literacy, which is often kind of our go-to when we ask these questions about critical consumption, technology participation, et cetera. there is good media literacy that really emphasizes kind of how do we use these technologies in effective ways and responsible ways. And I want us to push that even further. I want us to actually go to a place where students can ask sophisticated questions about how these things work, so that they can then understand how they play a role in the design and how they fit within the larger ecosystem of civic and political practice. You know, this idea of technical intuition, I'm borrowing from a nonprofit executive, a consultant named Ed.D, and they're really putting this idea out there because they worked with change makers all around the world, folks that were trying to use technology in order to, you know, do civic work. And what they saw was folks were struggling to be able to kind of articulate in practical terms how these technologies actually worked in a way that didn't allow them to then ask folks like Alex, what would be good technology to achieve the goals that I have? And so one way that Alex is arguing for technical integration is saying that we actually need to go beyond literacy, that we don't need these technologies to be legible, we need them to be pliable. Like we can actually have some sort of agency in the way that they're designed, the way they get deployed in different cases, and that's a creative process. And I want young people to feel like they have that sense of agency. They don't have to know how to code every little thing. They don't know how to build their own large language model or whatever it is. But they do need to have a sense about how these things work and what they're good for, so that they can ask questions about how it's functioning within the civic and political ecosystems that they're a part of.
You talk a lot about the importance of free spaces in education. Can you say a bit what you mean about this?
Sure. So my article very much is it's a very high level view of the space of civics. I'm spending a lot of time thinking about contemporary debates in civic learning and civic engagement. I'm engaging with Daniel Allen's book, Education and Equality, and the Boston Review series of responses to that. As well as Ethan Zuckerman's paper, which is more in the communications and SBS space, which is asking about, is there a new civics with the state of technology as we see it? And in those debates, we're really thinking about what is that question of empowerment, right? And that's why I titled the chapter Locating Empowerment, because there's a lot of different ways you could define empowerment. Danielle Allen has a way that she's framing it. Ethan Zuckerman is thinking about it in particular ways, and he's focused on those digital citizens, the folks that are doing a lot of that work online. And so when it comes down to then, how do we learn how to be effective civic participants? How do we become empowered, which is kind of necessary to be fully kind of realized citizens? I think it really comes down to having that practice. And so you know, there's good literature on democratic education, folks like Deborah Mayer and all of her work in that space. Mira Levinson is doing great work on this as well. And a lot of those folks have talked about action civics as a direction that we need to go in, this ability to actually do some work while we're in school. You know, developing policy ideas and putting them in front of policymakers in our community. Also thinking about how you are taking ownership over the kind of governance of the spaces that you're a part of. And so I was really inspired by this book by Sarah Evans and Terry Boyd called Free Spaces, which talks about those those spaces that we often don't consider as prevalent anymore in society, those places where communities come together and have their own organizations that they run. These are kind of like, you know, alumnus type of things, Rotary foundations, but often like all the little committees that are around town. But also when we think about schools, all of the student organizations, right, that are run by the students, not just student government, which is one of those pieces, but the other places where students are really in charge of making decisions and thinking through hard questions of what are we going to do next, right? That deliberative work. And I think we need more of those spaces because Sarah Evans and Harry Boyd say that that's really been a key engine through the US history of civic engagement, where folks got to practice that in spaces that were not overtly political, but they got the practice of developing those skills that are necessary for political work. right? And so I think we need more of those spaces for young people. We need to create more of those spaces for young people to engage in the local governance. I think one of those things means that we actually need to do a better job of localizing politics and civics, especially in the US, where so much of it is dominated by kind of national ideological agendas. Folks don't feel engaged in that, right? They often feel disempowered because they're not making those things, or they might have a false sense of empowerment because they're having a conversation maybe online that's part of a national conversation. It feels like they're participating in those things, but they're not having much impact. So we need to figure out how do we actually return to that local level where lots of folks do actually have opportunities to make real change, be leaders in those spaces, and through that kind of develop those civic identities that we need of, I'm able to do this stuff, right? It's part of my mindset and how I work, and I see the skills as something that I have some experience doing.
Thank you, thank you. I'd like to invite James and Lee to come up, and we will take questions from the audience. Thank you. Barney.
Sure, thank you. I think in the context, the current situation in which this book is coming out, we are about to have in America probably the most divisive presidential election in 160 years since the Civil War. It seems pretty clear who the two candidates will be, and they are quite different from each other, and we are a very divided country. So I'm wondering whether you have suggestions about how schools, teachers, classrooms can and should conduct themselves between now and the presidential election, which I think it's a safe prediction that our communities are going to be divided, maybe our families are going to be divided, and certainly our nation is going to be, I think, torn is not too strong a word.
I really want to get a teacher.
James.
All right, I'll try. I think, I guess I would lean into the uncertainty question on that. I guess teachers have a lot of responsibilities, kind of competing commitments and competing responsibilities, especially when it comes to civic life and what you rightly point out is a very, very bifurcated, divided, contentious age. Part of that is, I think, surfacing the responsibilities of citizenship, but it's also, I think, about caretaking. And you might also, there's also, I think, a civic responsibility about surfacing disagreements in a way that is agreeable. But I think how teachers learn how to do all of those things, all of which are extremely complicated, extremely values driven, and potentially very conflict oriented, that in order for teachers to make sense of all of those competing responsibilities, they have a responsibility to kind of sit with the conflict and sit with the uncertainty and sit with competing kind of ethical demands. And so I think part of that means like having this well-facilitated discussions about some of the issues, some of the values, and to be able to kind of name the kind of non-discussable elements in a place of relative, in a holding environment where people can disagree strongly, but in a way that holds the well-being of the community in hand as well. you feel like they're competing commitments, and I like, it's very hard to reconcile. And so, rather than giving a recipe, you have to do this, but not this. You have to help adults who can therefore help children to sit with all of the competing messiness of the current situation. But
I like that idea of that you need to understand, especially for educators, that role as a caretaker, as somebody who kind of creates space for folks to experience something together. You know, I spend most of my time thinking about the higher education context of this. I'm really focused on the undergraduate engineers that I teach on college and the types of civic education that I can provide them while they're with me for 4 years. And I think it's really important for me to create spaces for those students where they can be talking about social and political issues, stuff that is contentious, and kind of explore some of the nuance of those issues, some of that uncertainty, because they're not necessarily getting that in most of the you know, science and engineering curriculum that they're getting in other classes, right? So you kind of have to find other spaces for that to exist. I also think it's valuable to talk to the folks that really want to do something and help them imagine what it looks like to do something productive that kind of recovers some of that sense of agency and some of that sense of ability to do something on that local level, like I was saying. You know, I've been always very impressed by Harry Boyd, one of the folks who came up with the idea of free spaces. He actually created a K-12 kind of action civics like program called Public Achievement, which really comes out of the tradition of how you develop organizers, right? Folks that have an ability to understand how they are personally related to a socio-political issue, and how does that mean that there's a collection of people that can be connected around that issue, and then take that into opportunities to you know, create policy ideas or ask for governance that you get to share in, but starting from that position of, you know, really there is there's a way that we come together as a community, that we have shared ground, and we have to find that shared ground. And that's not easy, but there are ways to develop the skills that get you there. I think that is important to extend to the students as much as possible.
You can go first.
Okay, thank you. If I take the previous question and
Yes.
If I take the previous question and zoom it out to the international context, global context, and add the role of social media, how do you see where there is a rise of many dictators or dictatorial tendencies, and as well as there is a push from those dominant groups or governments using the social media dominant narratives and making it widespread in this country and also something else. On the other hand, social media is something that youth have access to, and they can connect with young people, not only in their communities, but communities around the world. So where do you see the threat? Where do you see the opportunities for young people around the world? And 2024 is not only the election in the US, in fact, us, many of the countries in the world having election in 2024. So, and how the young people can participate. You mentioned about pushing the tendencies of patriotism as opposed to civic engagement. Right? So how do you see or how do you advise teachers who work with young students who are in their high school, say, or secondary to high schools to navigate through this process? Thank you.
Yeah, it's really great. Yeah, this is a very tough question with very complicated context. But so based on my experience, I think, so because of the national context, in the Chinese context, the social media is very much controlled, and the government is very, the government is a pioneer in a way, using social media for control. But at the same time, the political and economic situation are very fluid. So things change so much just over the past few years. At the start of the pandemic, social media was used by the public as a place for outpouring of anger over the initial control of the COVID measures in China. And there were a lot of liberal voices, and things were very difficult for the government. But just in a few months, as China cracked down on COVID and lockdown and very effectively while the rest of the world started to struggle, the social media became the friend of the government again, and it was very effective, and students' political perspective changed so much just in a few months. However, then fast forward a few years back to 2022, when the zero COVID measure was like very top and behind in China, while the rest of the world started open. Social media again become a tool for change and protest, and a lot of things happened that, in a way, I think contributed to the opening of China again. So just a very fluid context, I think. During that time, I had a chance. I think most teachers in China won't really get to do this, but I had a chance to talk with students. I think back in 2020, when Black Lives Matter happened in the US, and a lot of Chinese were curious, but not having a lot of good information, and they tend to parallel the movement with pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, and they have a more pro-government view on that. So they, in a way, associate the Black Lives movement as movement of chaos and things like that. So I get a chance to talk with them, and it was via media, and also because my identity not as a teacher, I was able to have some kind of dialogue. So I think that is the moment of hope when they could access somebody outside of their system. And also on a topic that is not directly controlled by the Chinese government. I couldn't talk to them about Hong Kong, for example. I would be then out of the school access, but I can talk to them about Black Lives Matter. So I think that is an interesting very little invention. But I hope this kind of when something cracked open, like for example, COVID happened, or with something outside of their contract that can still allow them to engage in those kind of dialogue. I think that's my thought on the movement of hope.
But briefly, I think one of the things that we need to know more about in answer a question on, we don't fully understand how young people use social media. At least the public voice says, how do we control it? Grown-ups say, how can we stop kids doing this, this, and this? Actually, in this room, there are people who are doing extremely important work on actually how young people use social media. I think if we know more across internationally about the way they use it, the interactive contexting with groups, etc., we'd be in a better position to start thinking about how, as educators, we can more effectively do the kind of things that you think we should be doing. You have a question?
Yes, I have a question from Benjamin Bowman.
But you've got to all. Yes, hello, Ben.
Time and again, our best research tells us young people should be given the opportunity to play, explore, and think for themselves. And young people often do this themselves online. Yet schools and education systems seem to have an increasing, almost single-minded commitment to intensive standardized testing and so on. How can we make our work have an impact on policymakers who seem to have such a diverging concept of what education is and how we support it?
James. The start. You're lucky, I know this.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful, and a really challenging question. And I think I can kind of diverge a little bit from the chapter in the book, and I know our time is short. But some of the work that I've done since this chapter came out was with a consortium of districts in Massachusetts that's working on developing alternatives to standardized testing and MCAS and kind of working for more holistic assessments. And I think that the answer to that really good question, or one answer to that really good question, is to create proof points or kind of examples of divergent examples, kind of portraits or glimpses of what kind of a parallel present might look like. So introducing helping teachers think about more experiential, practice-based, performance-based assessments, which I know is used a lot in disciplines in higher education, but maybe not so much as well. The other thing is doing more centering the lived experiences of young people, so that we're asking them directly about what matters to them in schools, so that if those can be integrated into the stories that we tell about successes and shortcomings. But I think the policy is sticky, and so it is important to approach it with storytelling.
Thank you, Jen. We've run out of time. I want to thank our panel and to thank Janine for working with me on the editing, which has been so exciting. Thank our three people who are actually able to be here today, both extremely intelligent and interesting and provocative statements, and also to thank those who are the contributors who are out there on Zoom. Thank you for being part of the project, and thank you for being there today, at least virtually, and thank all of you for being here today. Thank you.